Hello, and welcome to today's webinar with the National Museum of the Pacific War. My name is Lauren, and I am the Adult Programs Coordinator here at the museum. Today, we are going to speak with an author. Her name is Shannon, and her new book is called The First Lady of World War II, and it's about Eleanor Roosevelt. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over for her presentation.
And thanks so much to everyone who has joined us today to hear about the extraordinary Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of World War II. This story begins in August 1943, when the United States had been at war with Japan for nearly 2 years. One night, a military transport plane traveling under the code name Flight 321 left San Francisco bound for the Pacific Theater. Inside the plane, it was bare bones, it was loud and rumbling, it was unpressurized, and it was freezing cold. On board, sharing space with supplies and sacks of mail, was First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. By the time Eleanor set out for the Pacific, she had been First Lady for a decade. She was famous for her travels, or infamous, depending on the perspective, and she constantly made headlines for them. When Eleanor entered the White House in 1933, the American public got a First Lady the likes of which they had never seen before. Traditionally, First Ladies stayed close to the White House, they primarily oversaw social functions, and they did not take an active part in public life. But being confined to the White House was not going to work for Eleanor. Instead, she created for herself a unique role that combined her love of travel, her wanderlust, with her sense of social responsibility. She ceaselessly crisscrossed the country, giving speeches, inspecting New Deal initiatives, seeing and meeting people, and gathering information. And that information she used to exact change, either through her own means or by providing it to the president and his policy advisors. 1 year into his presidency, FDR asked Eleanor to go to Puerto Rico to investigate labor and living conditions. And the fact that she took a flight over water to get there cemented her reputation as fearless and unconventional. And around that time, she was featured on the cover of this general interest magazine and declared America's most traveled First Lady. As First Lady, Eleanor averaged an astounding 40,000 miles on the road each year. And yet, even for such an experienced traveler like Eleanor, the Pacific trip exceeded anything she had previously done, including a wartime trip to Great Britain the year before in 1942. This time, she would be on the road longer than ever before, traveling farther and at a faster pace, covering more ground, enduring more discomforts, and facing danger. Eleanor traveled for 5 weeks and covered 25,000 miles, a distance roughly equal to the Earth's circumference. She went to Hawaii, Australia, New Zealand, through the South Pacific, and, at her insistence, into territory that was still under enemy air attack. Eleanor predicted that the Pacific trip would cost her deeply, both physically and mentally, and in fact, this turned out to be true. Early on in the research process for the book, I came across something she wrote in an autobiography 6 years after the trip to the Pacific, and she said, "The Pacific trip left a mark from which I think I shall never be free." And I found that statement so powerful and so haunting, and that she said it so many years later, and it really compelled me to uncover what she experienced during those 5 weeks in the Pacific. So why did she do it? Why did she commit herself to such an arduous undertaking? Eleanor was enormously driven to contribute to the war effort, and she especially felt a sense of obligation toward the generation of young men being sent into battle. A primary reason for the trip was to thank U.S. troops, thank them herself and on behalf of the president, and to build morale. And in all, she addressed more than 400,000 troops throughout her time in the Pacific. The trip was also an informal diplomatic mission to allied nations Australia and New Zealand, and to see the war work that women were doing in those countries. And Eleanor added even more onto her plate by going as a representative of the American Red Cross and inspecting the organization's facilities in the region. She packed no civilian clothing, and she wore only Red Cross uniforms throughout the trip, which pared down her clothing and helped her adhere to a strict luggage limit. Furthermore, the trip occurred at a crucial time in the war. By the summer of 1943, the tide was turning in the Allies' favor in Europe and the Pacific. Eleanor felt that people were overly optimistic about the war's outcome and that they were becoming dangerously complacent. There were strikes at war production factories across the country. People were complaining about food rationing and shortages. The trip would link the home front and the fighting front, reminding the nation that they could not give up on their duties until the war was won, and that any slackening in production risked the lives of the men on distant battlefields. And frankly, as Eleanor reminded people, winning the war was the way that their loved ones would come home. For security reasons, the trip was kept secret for the first 10 days as Eleanor made her way from island to island through the South Pacific. Her first inspection stop was Christmas Island, a speck of land so tiny she wondered why a large wave didn't come along and wash it away. Rumors were running rampant among the GIs on Christmas Island. They noticed that heightened security measures were being put in place and had them speculating that somebody important was coming to visit. They thought it might be a troop of chorus girls, or perhaps the politician Wendell Willkie, who had made an around the world tour and written a best-selling book about it. They were expecting a VIP, and yet they were astounded when Eleanor Roosevelt stepped off the plane. FDR specifically asked Eleanor to visit Christmas Island and other islands along the supply and communications route that linked the United States with Australia. It was vital to keep the route open and protected, and yet the men on these islands felt marginalized and distant from the fighting, and as if they weren't making enough of a contribution to the war. And FDR wanted Eleanor to assure them that he knew the valuable job they were doing. On Christmas Island, Eleanor set the rigorous pace that she would keep throughout the trip. After she got back, she was giving a speech, and an audience member asked her how many hours of sleep she got per night. She replied that she could get by on 5, but that she didn't always get them. She went nonstop the entire 5 weeks, sleeping on army cots and rustic huts, traveling by jeep over rough terrain to reach isolated camps, and doing things like climbing a lookout tower on Christmas Island and trekking through the jungle on a simulated training exercise to better understand jungle warfare, which was a new type of fighting for American servicemen. Eleanor visited Red Cross clubs. She dined in mess halls, getting up at dawn to breakfast with servicemen, and she walked miles and miles of hospital wards. She inspected everything from laundry rooms to artillery headquarters to a dentist tent in the Australian outback, where a serviceman was having a tooth removed without making a sound. He said afterward, "It hurt like hell, but with Mrs. Roosevelt watching, I had to act tough." Eleanor took every opportunity to speak with servicemen, finding out what they wanted and what they needed now and after the war. In Bora Bora, instead of breakfasting as expected in the officers' mess, she surprised down the ranks by eating with the enlisted men, and she borrowed mess gear from an awestruck young serviceman. Not only is the First Lady in an active theater of war, she's reporting to the president and the home front while she's there. During her decade as First Lady, Eleanor had built up an extensive network of outlets that she used to communicate with the American public, holding her famous women-only press conferences, giving speeches across the country, making radio addresses, and writing a 6-day-a-week syndicated newspaper column called My Day. The strict luggage limit I mentioned earlier, part of the reason she pared down her wardrobe by wearing the uniforms was because she lugged a heavy manual typewriter with her to the Pacific, so that she could keep writing My Day in real time, and she wired copy to her editor in New York. During World War II, Eleanor used her various platforms, including My Day, to support the war effort and to help guide the nation, from urging women to seek employment in the defense industry, to promoting the buying of war bonds and donating to the Red Cross Blood Bank, a new nationwide program at the time. The blood was turned into dried plasma and sent to the front lines, where it was kept in foxholes for ready use during battle. Eleanor buoyed morale, and she admonished when necessary, such as chastising Americans for believing enemy propaganda and doing Hitler's work for him. Eleanor also used My Day to help maintain the secrecy of the trip. For the first 10 days of the trip, she had pre-written columns, and the byline listed her location as being at home in Hyde Park, New York. Eleanor continued to make her way through the South Pacific until she reached the island of New Caledonia, where she ran into a roadblock. That roadblock was Admiral William Halsey, commander of the South Pacific forces, and the man who would decide whether or not she was allowed to visit the island of Guadalcanal, which was her ultimate goal of the trip. Admiral Halsey was not pleased to have Eleanor in the Pacific. He had nothing against her personally. He liked her. He admired her. What he didn't like were VIPs coming through his area and taking his focus away from the war, especially because he thought these visits were superficial PR junkets or political gestures. All very practical reasons that he objected, along with the fact that he would have to put on a tie. When Eleanor arrived at his headquarters, Admiral Halsey brusquely shut down the suggestion of her going to Guadalcanal, telling her, "Guadalcanal is no place for you, ma'am." Eleanor was devastated at this immediate shutting down of her request. Admiral Halsey did make a slight concession, saying that he would wait to make a final decision until after she visited New Zealand and Australia and returned to New Caledonia. And he would see what the status was of a current battle he was overseeing and whether he had the fighter planes available to escort her into Guadalcanal. But despite this slight concession, Eleanor left for New Zealand in really low spirits because she thought, given this initial reception, there was no way he was going to agree to her visiting Guadalcanal. After 10 days of secrecy, Eleanor landed in New Zealand, and news broke about the trip. There wasn't so much surprise that she turned up on the other side of the world, but that the trip had been such a well-kept secret. Eleanor was familiar to New Zealanders and Australians because of news coverage during her time as First Lady, and her reputation as an advocate for social justice preceded her. Eleanor was a presence on the global stage during World War II and a voice to the Allied nations. She made 3 wartime trips overseas to Great Britain, the Pacific, and a year later to the Caribbean area. She was asked to make morale-raising radio addresses to women in Sweden, Brazil, France, and other countries. A New Zealand newspaper called Eleanor a great fighter in the cause of the world's freedom. They were particularly impressed that she was perhaps the only woman at whom Hitler screamed his denunciations. For years, Eleanor had been publicly speaking out against Hitler and Nazi aggression, and the Nazis noticed. A German newspaper threatened her by name, and Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, wrote in his diary, "Mrs. Roosevelt is shooting her mouth off around the country. If she were my wife, it would be a different story." Well, she wasn't his wife. She was FDR's wife, and he supported what she was doing. Eleanor's visit to New Zealand and Australia was a historic event. She was the first US president's wife to visit, and it generated a level of excitement that was on par with royalty. Even blocking traffic in Sydney. This clipping is from a scrapbook sent to Eleanor by the New Zealand government commemorating the trip. Eleanor was a little frustrated in Australia because she was used to traveling unimpeded in the United States. In Australia, though, she had an entourage of US Army officers who insisted on following her around everywhere. One day, at a hospital, she came to the bed of a serviceman who handed her a long letter. She took out her glasses, she put them on, and she read the entire thing. She could see that this young man was distressed, and she ordered everyone, medical personnel, reporters, and high-ranking officers to go wait in the corridor while she spoke with this young man alone. And this is one instance out of many during the trip that illustrates Eleanor's caring about the servicemen on an individual level. After leaving Australia, Eleanor went off the grid again for security reasons, and the flight number was changed. She returned to Admiral Halsey's headquarters on New Caledonia, where she received some great news. She was going to Guadalcanal. Why the change of heart on Admiral Halsey's part? Ultimately, Eleanor won his support not by making arguments, but by the power of her example. They had spent some time together, her first time in New Caledonia, and then along with reports from other military personnel throughout the region and a tremendous amount of press coverage, he saw that her motivation was genuine and that the trip was no superficial PR junket. Eleanor Roosevelt was the real deal. Admiral Halsey later admitted to being sorry for his original surliness, and allowing her to go to Guadalcanal was a sign of his respect for her. Also, Admiral Halsey was shrewd. If all went well while Eleanor was on Guadalcanal, it would generate good publicity. You need good publicity to keep public approval high for the war and to keep funding flowing. But ultimately, what it came down to, and why I think he allowed her to go to Guadalcanal, was that morale wins wars. and he could see the uplifting effect her presence had on the troops. Here is this rough, gruff, tough admiral, and he said what he marveled at most were the expressions on the men's faces as Eleanor leaned over them in their hospital beds. He said most people came through his area, glanced into a sun parlor at a hospital, and left. Eleanor, meanwhile, as you can see in the photos, she went bed to bed comforting the wounded. And Admiral Halsey knew the importance of that. When he took over command of Guadalcanal, he visited the front lines as soon as he could. And on his way back to his headquarters, he stopped on another island to visit a naval hospital, and he went bed to bed speaking with injured servicemen. It not only buoyed their morale, it buoyed the morale of the men on Guadalcanal when they heard about it. Eleanor even went a step further. A practice she began in Great Britain was to keep logbooks of the wounded servicemen she met. In these logbooks, she recorded each person's name, his injuries, and where and how he received them, such as Second Lieutenant Leroy Mitchell, a bombardier in a B-17 who had a ruptured eye from being shot in the face during an attack by Japanese fighter planes in the skies over Papua New Guinea. Also recorded in the logbooks was the name and address of a family member for Eleanor to contact after her return, and she did contact the families. Letters took weeks to get to the Pacific and back, and to have recent firsthand news of your loved one from the First Lady of the United States was extraordinary. Although Eleanor called one serviceman's girlfriend and she hung up on her because she didn't believe it was the First Lady calling and she thought she was being pranked. So now, Admiral Halsey is fully on board with Eleanor's visit to Guadalcanal, and any misgivings he still had about her going were solely out of concern for her safety. Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands was the site of the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific War. Visiting Guadalcanal was a tribute Eleanor felt that she owed to the men in uniform to see where so many of them had lost their lives or received their injuries. The war was personal for Eleanor. She had 4 sons serving in various branches of the military on active duty, one of whom was a Marine who fought in the Solomon Islands campaign. In the early morning hours, under cover of darkness, Eleanor left for Guadalcanal in a heavily gunned U.S. Navy bomber, which flew with lights out to evade detection. She sat on a makeshift seat over the bomb bay, ears ringing and shivering in the dark. Despite the difficulties of the 3-hour ride, though, Eleanor was elated at achieving her goal. As the bomber closed in on Guadalcanal, 6 fighter planes appeared to escort it the rest of the way. As it turns out, Admiral Halsey's concerns about Eleanor's safety were warranted. Guadalcanal was bombed several nights before and after her visit, leading him to speculate whether the Japanese also had code breakers. With the manual typewriter Eleanor hauled around the Pacific, she kept a diary that was shared in installments with the president. And here in this entry, she described an air raid alert that sounded while she was on Guadalcanal. Along with the hospital staff and the ambulatory patients, she was taken to an underground shelter to wait for the all clear. After the all clear sounded, she didn't miss a beat, and she got right back to business going through the hospital wards. The danger associated with the trip didn't faze Eleanor. Even traveling in a military transport plane for 5 weeks was risky, as they weren't the most reliable aircraft. To save time, rather than design transport planes from scratch, the military modified heavy bombers. One pilot bluntly described a converted bomber to transport plane as an evil bastard contraption. On Eleanor's return home, the planned route was changed at the last minute because of reports of Japanese aircraft in the area for retaliatory raids. Eleanor had courage in spades, and as I said, the danger didn't concern her. What greatly impacted her was the massive scale of suffering she witnessed. She said that one sees the results of the war in the hospitals. Eleanor was a class act when she was going through the hospital wards, bed to bed, offering words of comfort or a joke. But she said that inside she was burning with resentment at what was being done to these young men and how they were bearing the brunt of the war. Eleanor was extremely forthright when reporting back to the American public and making them understand the human cost of the war. In a radio address after her return from the Pacific, she told of a young man she met in a first-line hospital, so recently injured that he was still in the set of bandages from when he fell in battle. All he had to his name was a Red Cross comfort kit. He was in pain, and yet he still managed to smile and thank the people helping him. In that same address, she told people to stop complaining about food rationing and shortages because it was nothing compared to lying on your back in a jungle swamp while an enemy camouflaged in the trees took shots at you. In another speech, she recalled the shadowed eyes of the men who had endured the savagery of jungle warfare. As Eleanor predicted, the trip took a huge physical and emotional toll on her. She lost 30 pounds while she was overseas, and when she returned home, she fell into a deep depression. A close friend of hers explained it by saying, as long as she had to keep going, her iron will carried her through in spite of her deep horror at what she saw and the great sadness at the continued bloodshed and dying. As Time magazine pointed out, no other U.S. mother had seen so much of the panorama of the war, had been closer to the sweat and boredom, the suffering. And yet the Pacific trip made Eleanor determined to work even harder to see the war through and to strive for peace so that this carnage never happened again. A near-term goal was to see a support program established for returning servicemen. During all of the conversations that she had with servicemen in mess halls and Red Cross clubs throughout the Pacific, the things she heard most were that they needed supplies to win the war and they wanted opportunities for jobs and education when they returned home. And Eleanor used the power of her public platform to help ensure that this was done, bringing pressure to bear on Congress. As a soldier explained to Eleanor, and she shared this in my day, they weren't afraid of being killed or maimed. What they were afraid of is that when they finally returned home and began to piece their lives back together, that they would be made to feel like suckers for the sacrifices they had made. And the GI Bill of Rights was signed into law the next year. Due to the concern about the retaliatory raids on Eleanor's way home, the transport plane was detoured to Christmas Island, where she had begun the trip weeks earlier. When controversy erupted over Eleanor's trip, the soldiers on Christmas Island had her back, and they took on her detractors in their troop publication. A GI journalist reported, her kindness and consideration brought this island of forgotten men very much back to life. It takes great courage to do what Mrs. Roosevelt is now doing, and you have to hand it to her. She has what it takes. During the dozen years Eleanor spent as First Lady, upending tradition, breaking new ground, her journey to the front lines most powerfully illustrates how dramatically she transformed the role. The Pacific trip exemplifies so much of what is admired about Eleanor: her courage, her compassion, her connections with people, and her crusading for a better world. It also shows how important her leadership was during World War II. A reporter at the time described Eleanor's trip to the, and I believe this still stands, as the most remarkable journey any president's wife has ever made. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Shannon, and for being with us here today. We really appreciate your time. Right now, we're going to move into our interactive section where we invite our virtual audience to submit questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Just getting some notes. I'm ready.
Before we move into that, or to give them a little bit of time before they submit their questions, I have a question for you. And it has to do with the view of the First Lady. Do you think Eleanor helped to shift the view we now have of the First Lady and what they do and causes they may or may not take on?
Absolutely, I think that she did. And what she did was path-breaking and unconventional. One of Eleanor's biographers said that before Eleanor, First Ladies were really like a part of the furniture at the White House. And so it really was really unique what she did. And I do think that First Ladies after that, what it did was it gave them a choice, you know, about stepping out of the White House if they wanted to.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions that have come in. So our first one is, did FDR support her trip?
Yes, FDR was supportive of this trip, and he was supportive of all of Eleanor's travels in general. He did benefit from it politically. The information that she gathered while she was in places, she would take back to him. But I also think that it was something that he knew that she needed personally, and that sense of freedom that it gave her. And so yes, I think that's one of the really neat things is he was very supportive because, you know, think about a woman traveling alone without her husband in the 1930s and 40s. that in and of itself was quite startling for people.
Okay, our next question is, do we know any details about Eleanor Roosevelt's stay in Hawaii and meeting with Admiral Nimitz during this trip?
That is a good question. She touched down briefly in Honolulu on her way out to the Pacific. And they had a bit of a scare because they thought that there was a reason that the trip might become known that she was there. But thankfully, that didn't happen. It was still kept under wraps. And she ended up, she stayed in Honolulu for several days on her return back. And I know that she met with Admiral Nimitz, but I didn't have a lot of details about their meeting, either from her or through Admiral Nimitz's writings. But I do know that they did see each other there, and there are photographs of them together.
All right, excellent. Our next question is, did you mention her visit to Lieutenant Hugh Barr Miller Jr.?
Yes, so that is in the book. And I love that whoever asked that, thank you. Because when Eleanor returned to Admiral Halsey's headquarters in New Caledonia, and she received the news that she was going to Guadalcanal, and he allowed her to go to Guadalcanal as a sign of his respect for her, another sign of his respect for her was allowing her to participate in the medal ceremony for Lieutenant Hugh Barr Miller, who had endured a very harrowing time, several weeks alone, fighting Japanese on an island. And there are also, I do talk about that in the book, and there are pictures as well of Eleanor with Hugh Barr Miller.
We have one more question from our virtual audience. How did they convert Eleanor's typewritten records into a wire to send home?
They hooked her up with, so there were military, another excellent question. I love this audience. There were journalists in the Pacific covering. And so whenever she got to a destination, they would hook her up with somebody at one of those journalistic outposts or offices, and they would get the copy, they would wire the copy. And the other thing is that like any other journalist in the Pacific, Eleanor had to adhere to wartime censorship rules, which were they were highly restrictive in the Pacific theater, a little less restrictive on the home front. So she could not mention certain islands by name. She couldn't mention the number of troops stationed on bases. So she was there, and that's one of the extraordinary things. She was there as a reporter.
Okay, let's see. Do we have any other questions? So we don't have any other questions coming in right now. So if you have one, there is space, there is time. Go ahead and put that in the chat box. But I have another question for you. Do you have a favorite fact about Eleanor Roosevelt?
I love that, well, Eleanor was an early advocate of commercial air travel at a time when it was thought that only courageous and athletic people could fly. And so she flew all the time. She heavily promoted flying, encouraging the public to do it as well. But one of the facts that I really love is she actually wanted to be a pilot herself. And she passed the necessary physical exam to be a pilot. She was set to have Amelia Earhart as her instructor. But FDR had recently been elected president, and he really did not ask Eleanor to, he really didn't make many restrictions or ask her to pull back on anything. But he did say, look, I'm about to be president. I have enough worries. Could you please, I can't worry about you up in the sky flying a plane. And so she did acquiesce to that request of his.
Okay, we have one last question. Did she take an assistant with her to help in any way?
Eleanor had a secretary and traveling companion, Malvina Thompson. She did go to Great Britain with Eleanor, but everything that Eleanor did generated such controversy that she thought that she would go alone. So she did not take Malvina Thompson or anybody else with her to the Pacific because she was hoping that it would cut down on criticism if she just took a single seat on a regular transport plane. Unfortunately, she got a lot of flack and controversy anyway. So in hindsight, she wished that she had taken her with her, but she did not.
We actually had a follow-up question to something you mentioned earlier that we have just enough time for. So you mentioned soldiers, what soldiers wanted after the war. Was she involved in the GI Bill?
I think that her real contribution was using her public platforms to bring pressure to bear on Congress. And so, to my knowledge, I'm not sure that she was extensively involved in the actual crafting of the legislation, or I have no doubt, being Eleanor Roosevelt, that she was passing notes and memos to people with her suggestions, especially because she did hear so much from the soldiers in Great Britain and the Pacific. And the other thing that she did was, right before she went to the Pacific, she used My Day to encourage the public to go to their local representatives and tell them what they wanted and what their servicemen wanted.
Okay, I promise this is the last question. We have one.
I love questions.
Did she have any bodyguards with her on the trip?
Not bodyguards per se. She did travel with, so they assigned like a press escort with her. So, and she flew with the same crew on the transport plane. The same crew flew her and in the same plane. Like I said, in Australia, she was surrounded by U.S. Army officers. So no bodyguards per se, but there would seem to always be people hovering around her. And she didn't like that. She went about unimpeded in the United States, and she had won a showdown with the Secret Service to go about on her own. And so she was a little frustrated in Australia because of that. She just wanted to be left alone and let loose to speak with servicemen and, ordinary soldiers, as she said, and with women working in the defense industries in Australia and New Zealand. So she would have liked way less military presence.
Okay, so we are going to wrap up with our questions for today. I want to say thank you, Shannon, for joining us and sharing your presentation and the information that you have gathered about Eleanor Roosevelt. I'm sure we all had a really great time learning about her, because I know I learned a lot about her that I didn't know before. So thank you for that. I also want to say thank you to our virtual audience. We really appreciate you coming and viewing the presentations with us. I noticed we had people from all over, Illinois, Alaska, the UK. That's amazing. And I have 3 things that I want to put on everybody's radar to look out for in the future. One, we have our last outpost out at the combat zone this Saturday, November 18th. Also, I want to let everybody know that Shannon's book right here is available for purchase on our website as well as in our store. So if you're local, you can come to our store and pick up a copy. And then our last thing I want to put on everybody's radar is that we do have our annual Nimitz dinner coming up in February. So look for more information on our website for that. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today, and we will see you next time.